Well, we're living the apocalyptic picture. That's the problem. I mean, 15% of our species in the UK are in danger of extinction. Most of our principal habitats are in decline or in poor health. In my lifetime, not that that's necessarily a fair reference when it comes to measuring biodiversity and environmental decline, but in my lifetime we've seen very significant declines in species that live in the UK. Globally, we've lost 69% of the world's wildlife since 1970. 69% of the world's wildlife has vanished since 1970, less than my lifetime.
So look, COP15, explain that to us. Didn't we just have COP27?
We did.
What's this about?
Well, we did. So there is a separate conference of parties, and has been for some time, which is addressing the biodiversity crisis. Not that the COP27 shouldn't have been addressing that as well, but we have this separate entity, and it runs in parallel, sometimes out of sync with the other COPs. But it's where the world's scientists, if you like, and world's leaders can come together to focus particularly on the loss of biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is simply the richness of life. So that's how we measure it. It's a completeness index. So you can have a low biodiversity in a very harsh, hostile environment like a desert. You wouldn't expect to find too many plant or animal species in an environment like that. But it's the completeness. If 10 things can live there and you've only got 2, then you're in trouble. If you've got 10, then your biodiversity is intact. But what we know, of course, is that our biodiversity, both nationally, locally, and globally, is in severe trouble. We live in one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. As measured by that biodiversity index, which means that we've lost a tremendous richness and density of life from our environment here in the UK, and we're very keen to address that.
Okay, well, so the Urgent Conversation campaign that you're talking about, what exactly are you calling for?
Well, to instigate that urgent conversation, I think it's fair to say that conversations are constantly had now about the climate crisis that we find ourselves in, both at political and domestic level. We're all aware of that, and we know that the potential damage that it's going to do and the damage it's currently doing. But I think that, rather unfortunately, biodiversity is struggling to keep up, which is ironic because, the two are intrinsically linked. Obviously, changes to our climate can be very detrimental to that biodiversity, and in fact, biodiversity has an impact on climate too. When you think about how important the rainforests are for influencing global weather patterns and so on and so forth. So they are linked together. And I think it's also, important that we state that, biodiversity isn't just lots of exotic animals swinging around in a tropical jungle somewhere. Biodiversity are the bacteria in the soils that grow the foods that we eat. And the world's soils are in real trouble, and so therefore, in terms of our agricultural security, we have to think about biodiversity. So it's not an abstract thing that isn't connected to each and every one of us. It's not simply a thing that might, a loss of which might aggravate naturalists like myself. It's something which is going to impact on everyone's lives. And particularly, again, when you think of things like the marine environment, 8 out of 10 of the world's largest fisheries are overfished. We are diminishing their biodiversity, and yet we are dependent upon those fish in many places in the world as a central foodstuff in our diets. So looking after biodiversity is something that we should be equally concerned about addressing as we are with the climate.
Do biodiversity and environmentalism always go hand in hand, or are there sometimes tensions there? I mean, environmentalism in terms of CO2 specifically, of course, because environmentalism is a big term.
No, I don't think so. I don't see any tensions or rivalry. As I say, once you read into the subject, and you don't have to delve too deeply, you realise that these things are intrinsically linked, and one is impacting the other. There's a certain very vicious circle there. I think it's merely a perceptual thing. I think in the past, biodiversity is something that's always been dealt with by conservation as opposed to environmental care. Because we've sought to preserve the life as best we possibly can, hence our network of nature reserves in the UK, green spaces in our cities, encouraging people to look after nature in their gardens. That's all about protecting biodiversity, but it's not a dissimilar conversation or unlinked to the fact that we're asking people to think about how they use water and energy and what they consume in terms of their food because of the impact that has on the environment. So no, in a way, I like the idea of the separate COP because it will focus our attention specifically on this issue, but we have to be clear that this is integrated with everything else when it comes to protecting our future. And it's brilliant that at this critical time, the UK NGOs, spearheaded by the RSPB, have put together a campaign to not only ask our Prime Minister to attend the COP, which he should, of course, anyway, but also to make significant pledges at the COP to do two things. One, to ensure that he meets his promise and his party's promise to invest significantly in protecting the biodiversity here in the UK. As I mentioned, it's one of the worst places in the world. But also, obviously, the UK is not an isolated part of the world. Every single square foot and metre of water has an impact all over the world. We have to be looking at addressing global biodiversity as well, and that means that we should be encouraging leaders in other parts of the world to take similar care. And at the moment, I have to say, hand on heart, we're well behind. Promises have been made, targets have been set, none of them have been met, none of the money has come to fruition. And it's a big ask. I mean, I've got to be very clear. The petition which we've got on the urgentconversation.org website, which I'd obviously like people to visit, is asking our contemporary Prime Minister to invest £56 billion, that's a lot of money, in restoring the biodiversity here in the UK. Now, it may sound like a lot of money. It's probably about a third of how much HS2 is going to cost. It's about comparable to what we spent on the furlough scheme during COVID. But this is not about a short-term investment. This is not about getting people through a very difficult period in a pandemic, and nor is it about investing in transport infrastructure that's going to be working for a certain number of years. Spending £56 billion on the UK biodiversity is about protecting the future of all of our children and grandchildren for a long way to come. So if I had my hands on the coffers and my hand on the pen and the checkbook, I'd be writing that out, because I see that as a very significant and important spending plan.
I mean, you'd think for a Conservative Prime Minister, conservationism ought to be an instinct for Conservatives, you'd have thought. In a way, you'd think it would almost be an easier sell than broader environmentalism. It's about preserving nature, it's about preserving our environment. Do you get a sense that the government is as on board with this as you'd like them to be?
No, I'm afraid I don't, and I wouldn't specify that to just the UK government. I think what we see when we look at and monitor the COP27 that we've just had is that none of the world's leading governments really have their finger on this pulse. And I think that, unfortunately, we're living in a period of time where short-termism is seen to be the solution to so many of our problems. It's all about a fix today, which will help us tomorrow, but not next week or further down the line. And the sorts of investments that we need to make when it comes to looking after the world's biodiversity and its climate are longer term. We can't fix that. You can't make a change to a tax law that will have an impact on the economy in the next 2 or 3 weeks. When it comes to the environment, that requires significantly more future thinking, clear thinking, and I suppose, given the structure of the way our political systems work, a certain degree of bravery. You've got to commission things, you've got to, set in place spending plans which will not come to fruition during your term of office, nor the next term of office, nor the other. So that's something which can be a hard sell for politicians too. They have to come to us, the people, and get our backing for the plans that they want to outline. After all, they are our elected representatives. They're there to represent us. And that means that we've got to win the hearts and minds of the public as well. And that means that's where my job and the RSPB's job, the other NGO's job is. We're there to inform and educate people so that when they're confronted with a £56 billion bill, they know that it's worth spending that money. And to do that, we do everything we can to engage. That's the key thing. But we've got to broaden our audience, and that's again why the Urgent Conversation campaign is good. We've had a video made. A famous choreographer has got together and produced a dance which replicates the sort of murmurations, and murmurations are those collections of birds like starlings we see in the wintertime. They've become very, very popular. Lots of people, even if they're not massively into wildlife now, journey to see those murmurations during the course of the winter. So this is something which is a dance, it's an art form, it's very beautiful. And that speaks to a different audience than I typically speak to when I'm making my television programme. So again, I'd urge people to look at that. If you're into contemporary dance, or looking at ways that people can interact with nature and replicate that and try and understand it, then take a look at that commemoration.
Briefly then, before I let you go, aside from Rishi Sunak going along, attending, what are the big takeaways you want to see from COP15? What are the big things you really want it to achieve?
Like many other conservationists and environmentalists, I'm rather tired of targets that are set so far in the future they're meaningless. So I don't want to be listening to 2050, or I'm not entirely happy with 2030. The issues that we face here are extremely urgent, and they need to be dealt with today, not by 2030. So setting targets in terms of transition can be a good thing. There's no doubt about that. We're not going to make all of the changes we need to overnight. We've got to be realistic. So there are time spans, but I would argue that those targets need to be set as close to the present as possible. And I think that ultimately this does involve spending money. And it does involving the populace, the global populace. That we need people on board. We need people to understand that this is about their health, their future, the future health and the happiness of their children and grandchildren, and of course of the planet. And we have the answers. I think that if I was, here campaigning from a point of debilitation, where you could say to me, "Well, can we fix it?" And I say, "Well, I'm not entirely sure about that." But I know that we have the capacity to reinstate, restore and repair the environment. I know we have the capacity to increase that biodiversity and stop the loss of it, if only we would roll out those measures more broadly and more urgently. So that's what I'd like to see from that COP. Broad, urgent action, meaningful action, significant targets set and met, and frankly, again, just as we've seen with the COP27, the richer nations will have to support the poorer nations across the world. We're one species on one planet with one big problem and one last chance to sort it out. And we'll only sort it out if we come together with equality.
And look, one more if I may, just in an immediate British sense. What does biodiversity collapse look like for us? What do we lose? Is it about looking out in your garden and seeing far fewer garden birds? Is it about the countryside being very different? What's the apocalyptic picture here?
Well,
or indeed the real picture?
We're living the apocalyptic picture. That's the problem. 15% of our species in the UK are in danger of extinction. Most of our principal habitats are in decline or in poor health. In my lifetime, not that that's necessarily a fair reference when it comes to measuring biodiversity and environmental decline, but in my lifetime we've seen very significant declines in species that live in the UK. Globally, we've lost 69% of the world's wildlife since 1970. 69% of the world's wildlife has vanished since 1970, less than my lifetime. Here in the UK, farmland birds, as you've mentioned, woodland birds, our garden birds, there are so many pressures on them now. We've had bird flu recently devastating our wild bird populations. We've got overuse of and overdependence of chemicals, particularly pesticides, in our agricultural system. We've got the least wooded environment anywhere in Western Europe, 13% forest cover in the UK compared to, say, 39% in France. So, when we talk about deforestation, we start wagging our finger at Brazil for cutting down its rainforest. We should really look out the window and recognise that, we've got a lot less forest in the UK than Brazil still has in it. So sorting out the problems in our own backyard is something that we're capable of doing, we should be doing, we can do, and certainly to set a standard across the world. We can't just be moaning about everyone else if we're not fixing it ourselves.